Without further ado, let me turn it over to my colleague, Laura Moy.
Thank you. Thanks for that great introduction. So good morning, everybody. Good morning and welcome. Thanks for being here so early in the day to start the conference off with a sprint. So as we begin our first conversation of the day, I want to read you a brief excerpt from the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals decision just last week on Trump's revised travel ban. The order makes no finding that nationality alone renders entry of this broad class of individuals a heightened security risk to the United States. The order does not tie these nationals in any way to terrorist organizations within the 6 designated countries. It does not provide any link between an individual's nationality and their propensity to commit terrorism or their inherent dangerousness. In short, the order does not provide a rationale explaining why permitting entry of nationals from the 6 designated countries under current protocols would be detrimental to the interests of the United States. So I'd like to think about that for a minute. But if we simply began the discussion there, at the present, we would be missing so much important history and context here, because the Trump administration's attempted travel ban, with its focus on banning nationals of 6 specific countries, that's in many ways an attempt to repeat history. So rather than starting abruptly now in 2017, we're going to begin today's examination of immigrant surveillance in the United States back in the 1800s. And just to add a little personal note, let me say that for me, this is a particularly meaningful point to begin this conversation, because some of my ancestors were arriving in the United States around the time that our conversation begins. Not the Irish and German ancestors who were still back in the old country, but the Chinese ancestors, the Mois. My great-grandfather, who was born in China, he settled in Chicago in the late 1870s. And as I've worked to document my family's history, I've read quite a few newspaper articles of the day, articles that referred to my great-grandfather's community as Celestials, Confucians, Mongolians, articles that lampooned their accents, that breathlessly detailed their heathen customs, and published the menus they enjoyed, the entire menus of the foods that they ate at banquet celebrations. Popular writing of the day alleged that the Chinese were impossibly different from Westerners, that the Chinese were cruel and antisocial, that the Chinese were incorrigible drug consumers, that they lived in squalid, crowded conditions and had no interest in attaining American living standards. And what happened? As Professor Ngai is going to discuss in just a moment, just a few years later, Congress actually passed a law that made it unlawful for people from China to immigrate to the United States. Thanks to that law, when my great-grandmother arrived from China, she had to meet and marry my great-grandfather in Vancouver before she could set foot on U.S. soil. Every time someone in the family wished to exit or enter the country, they had to subject themselves to a lengthy and intrusive investigation. Surveillance, disproportionate specific surveillance, became a part of life, and that law stood for some 60 years. And Indians were soon treated similarly. A few decades after the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed, Congress banned Indian immigrants, not by name, but by drawing a box around the region and calling it an Asiatic barred zone. Proponents of Indian exclusion argued that a great many Indians were anarchists and revolutionaries. And how did they address this? As Professor Seema Sohi is going to explain, they ramped up border policing, surveillance, and enforcement. It sounds familiar, doesn't it? And that's the focus of this first conversation. The things we're hearing today about efforts to exclude vast numbers of people from our shores, these are echoes of what we've been hearing throughout history in the United States. And to illustrate that past for us and its ties to the present day, it's my pleasure and my honor to introduce our speakers. First, Professor Ngai of Columbia University, a legal and political historian who's interested in questions of immigration, citizenship, and nationalism. And after Professor Ngai, Professor Seema Sohi of the University of Colorado-Boulder, who researches and writes about ethnic studies and whose book, Echoes of Mutiny, discusses race, surveillance, and Indian anti-colonialism in North America. So let's give them a warm welcome.
This is forward. Can you do full screen? Okay, thank you. Good morning. Thank you very much, Professor Moy, and I want to give special thanks to Georgetown Law, the Center on Privacy and Technology, Alvaro Bedoya, and Katie Evans and Harrison Rudolph, who've been so helpful in welcoming here today. So, okay, it works. There are many parallels between Chinese exclusion and the Muslim ban, or what I would call Muslim exclusion. I think travel ban is just a euphemism. Not least is the racial religious animus leading to group-based discrimination. But more than parallels and analogies, there is a direct connection in the legal foundations that justify these exclusions. That foundation is the rationale of national security and the extraordinary executive power attached to the power to exclude. So what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to talk about Chinese exclusion, but what I want to do is draw you a genealogy from Chinese exclusion to Muslim exclusion. So I'm not going to go over this in detail because I'm sure you all know about it, but just to say that these words are from the second executive order, which modified the first executive order, mostly with some cosmetic changes. But it's made clear that national security is the purpose of the order, even if the actual national security purpose is demonstrably weak. And we have here the authority that the president used for this ban in Section 212F of the Immigration and Nationality Act. Now, what I want to emphasize here is that national security was not always the foundation of American immigration law. Before the Civil War, entry to the United States was not only wide open and practically unregulated, but there was also no federal regulation because Southern slaveholders did not want federal authority over the movement of their slave property. It was only after the Civil War that authority shifted to the federal government. In 1875, there were a number of cases involving state laws that imposed immigration taxes and bonds on arriving immigrants. They were all struck down on grounds that the regulation of commerce was federal responsibility. So the authority to regulate immigration was located in the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. Immigrants were conceived as articles of commerce, highlighting the economic nature of migration and migrants as workers. Now, the Chinese exclusion cases shifted federal authority to a different jurisprudential location, that of national security. And I think it's worth reading this from the Supreme Court's case, Che Champing, which is also known as the Chinese exclusion case in 1889, which very clearly states that Chinese are a danger because they are an unassimilable race, and that as foreign agents of a foreign power, their exclusion may be warranted by the federal government. Now, the idea that Chinese are unassimilable is a fiction, and the assertion that they are foreign agents, or that immigrants in general are agents of foreign states, is likewise a fiction. And I find this particularly ironic because throughout most of the 19th century, Chinese emigration was unlawful. It was forbidden by the Qing dynasty, so they could hardly be considered agents of a foreign state if they were leaving unlawfully. And the United States, frankly, was settled by people carrying royal patents and charters. And one could say, you know, they themselves were agents of European empires. But in any case, this idea that immigrants are agents of foreign states is the basis for the so-called plenary power, plenary in this sense meaning absolute power, and the extraordinary, nearly unlimited power of the executive and a near total lack of rights that aliens have in matters of immigration. Now, this includes matters of admission And here the logic of national security or national sovereignty naturalizes the idea that no person outside the nation has the presumptive right to enter. Right? And this is something that most people will say to you today, that nobody outside the United States has a right, a standing right to enter. Although, notwithstanding the fact that virtually all borders were open to the United States until World War I. But not only admission, but also in matters of removal, do immigrants have no rights. And this idea remains, I think, to many people today, much more problematic, insofar as it often means removing people who have become part of society, tearing them from families, property, community ties, etc. Now, it was just to justify the racism against Chinese that the Supreme Court would state in Fang Yuting, which was the first slide that I showed you, that, quote, aliens enter and remain in the United States only with the license, permission, and sufferance of Congress. So this was aimed initially at the so-called obnoxious Chinese, but it laid down a general policy that has endured to this day, applicable to all aliens, or more precisely to any aliens or group of aliens that the government wishes to exclude or remove. And this was important because in the 1880s, if the government was to just ban Chinese because they were Chinese, they would be subject to charges of discrimination under the 14th Amendment. Okay, so by placing immigration outside the Constitution as a matter of foreign relations, it put immigration in the same basket with Congress's conduct of foreign affairs. So, for example, immigration regulation is in the same category as the right, Congress's right to declare war on foreign nations, and its duty to make and ratify treaties. Most prominently, the plenary power and the national security argument have been invoked to authorize not only Chinese exclusion, but the exclusion of other Asian peoples. And this included registration, certificates of identity. For Chinese, they had to carry certificates of identity like an internal passport, which, if not produced on demand, could lead to deportation. And Asian exclusions were not repealed until the World War II era. National security also authorized the wartime internment of Japanese Americans, including American citizens, including registration and lengthened questionnaires to determine loyalty. And more recently, the national security argument was used to authorize the registration requirement of Muslim and Arab Americans under the NSEERS program. Oops, I don't want to go there yet. Extreme vetting is a new term coined by the president, but the substance of it has long accompanied our exclusion laws. Interrogation of immigrants with claims to enter legally, in the Chinese case, often as merchants or even as U.S. citizens. At Angel Island, which was erected in San Francisco Bay, Chinese and other Asians were detained for days, weeks, months, and some even for years while they were interrogated to try to disprove their claims of identity. Now, the executive order is interesting because it calls for uniform screening and vetting standards, which include in-person interviews and a database of identity documents to ensure that people are not committing fraud. But I think the in-person interview is a very interesting program or proposal because this is highly subjective, right? A lot will depend on what questions are asked and the attitude of the questioner. And we can see here that Trump's views and he said this when he signed the first executive order, and he talked about the interview process. He said, "We only want people to come to our country who love deeply America." And he was going to apply this to non-immigrant visa applicants, meaning tourists, businessmen, foreign students, right? That this is a high standard for non-immigrant visa applicants. And previously he had stated that categorically Muslims could not love deeply America because he says Islam is a hateful religion. Islam hates us. And he says it's very hard to define, right? It's hard to separate because you don't know who's who, right? So you see embedded in his language this very hateful, this categorical discussion of Muslims. The Muslim bans also include the collection and dissemination of data on Muslim immigrants. And here you can see the kinds of surveillance and public surveillance that would take place. I've been told I have to stop, so I'm just going to very quickly show you these last slides on the consequences of exclusions and resistance and challenges that we have today, which are both taking place on the ground in the streets as well as in the courts. So thank you very much for your time.
Good morning. Thank you so much for being here, and thanks to Alvaro and the conference organizers for putting together such a remarkable program and for inviting me to be a part of it. So this past February marked the 100-year anniversary of the passage of the 1917 Immigration Act. And when this act was passed, it constituted the most sweeping immigration law in U.S. history. It had numerous restrictions, but there are two that I want to highlight today. The first has already been mentioned, the barred zone, the Asiatics barred zone, which excluded all peoples living within a geographic region that covered almost all of Asia. Now, because Chinese and Japanese laborers were already effectively excluded, the Barred Zone Act was intended to prohibit the entry of Indian migrants. The second provision of the 1917 Immigration Act that I want to focus on is one that increased the statute of limitations for deportation from 3 to 5 years for any immigrant deemed to have subversive or dangerous political beliefs or associations, namely those that could be construed as aligned with anarchism. Now, while it may seem as if these two critical provisions of the act, right, one that effectively excluded Indians and the other that cracked down on those deemed subversive, had little to do with one another, they were in fact deeply intertwined. By 1917, Indians in the United States were being racialized and criminalized as a Hindu menace. And this is a misnomer. The vast majority of Indians that came to the U.S. were Punjabi Sikh migrants, but they were referred to, right, as this kind of as a Hindu menace, which is a consolidation of racial images, and I would argue a distinctly anti-radical racial formation that linked aliens and radicals, right, in the public imaginary. So U.S. immigration officials and labor groups and congressional representatives had been pushing for Indian exclusion for over a decade prior to the passage of the 1917 Immigration Act. And public agitation against Indian migration sort of erupted in the late summer of 1907 when nearly 200 Indian workers were forcibly driven out of Bellingham, Washington, at the hands of an angry mob. In their exclusionary campaigns to exclude Indians, white workers across the Pacific coast linked their own struggles, right, as workers, to their white working class counterparts in Canada, South Africa, and Australia. And they saw themselves as part of a broader effort to protect and enforce what were commonly referred to as white men's countries by demanding the passage of exclusionary immigration laws. And so this kind of racial violence, this racial terror, right, is was quite common in Asian American history, and against Chinese, against Japanese, and of course against Indian migrants. In the aftermath of the Bellingham riots, Indians began explicitly linking racial violence and discrimination in North America to colonial subjugation in India. And so it was this kind of racial violence that really worked to mobilize a migrant labor force, many of whom were not political activists when they came to the US, 50% of whom were in fact veterans of the British Indian Army. And so their encounter with racial violence, right, in the US is what served to politicize them and mobilize them, and ultimately to organize an anti-colonial movement from which they attempted to overthrow the British Raj in India from the Pacific coast of the United States. So their anti-colonial politics quickly caught the attention of US officials, and this was particularly evident at some congressional hearings that were held in the spring of 1914, when the US House of Representatives Committee on Immigration and Naturalization met to discuss two bills aimed at imposing severe restrictions on the entry of what were called Hindu laborers. So the hearings were initially framed around a narrative that was quite familiar, I think, to people who study Asian exclusion: economic competition, labor threats, an American standard of living. But as the hearings went on, calls for Indian exclusion became indistinguishable from the committee's anxieties over Indian anti-colonialism. Committee Chairman John Burnett of Alabama insisted, quote, that a great many of Hindus seeking entry to the United States are anarchists, teaching the principle of the overthrow of government, end quote. Representative John Raker of California insisted that Indians were making the country a hotbed of revolution. And by the end of the hearings, a number of representatives were insisting that Indians were dangerous and subversive agitators whose exclusion went hand in hand with the repression of various forms of radicalism deemed a threat to the nation's security. And so Indians were kind of alternatively referred to as anarchists, Bolshevists, seditionists. So by the time of the congressional hearings in 1914, right, congressional representatives were well aware of the Indian anti-colonial movement that had been forged from the Pacific coast. And when I say anti-colonial movement, I mean, this was a heterogeneous movement. There were many different players and leaders involved, but the most well-known was a group called the Gadar Party. And Gadar can be translated as revolution or mutiny. And this was a coalition of Punjabi Sikh migrant workers and Bengali and Punjabi intellectuals and students, and it was headquartered in San Francisco. And I apologize, the order is a bit off. These were the headquarters initially when it was formed in 1913. This is on Valencia Street in the Mission District of San Francisco. And so all these different activists, right, they viewed their struggles against racism and exclusion in the United States as linked to the struggles of racialized and colonized people across the world fighting for racial equality and political independence. And for this, right, for this kind of anti-colonial politics, they were deemed threats to U.S. security and the British Empire and became the targets of U.S., British, and Canadian surveillance in North America. This is just an image of, so Gadar's printing press was located in San Francisco, and they printed every week a periodical and a volume of poetry, later by the workers themselves, and circulated them. It was immediately banned in India. Every Indian migrant that returned to India from North America was searched, and surveillance reports that I've looked at in the National Archives indicate that British officials were looking for copies of Gadar. And so this is Gadar the Gunj, which is translated as Echoes of Mutiny. So the British impetus, I think, here is quite clear, right? These revolutionaries were actively working to overthrow the British Raj. The motivations of the U.S. might be less apparent, but the way in which it came to be articulated, right, the need for Indian exclusion was about, it was a domestic priority, right, that they represented a menace, okay, posed by foreign radicals who should not be emboldened to organize subversive political movements on U.S. soil. And they also represented a foreign anxiety, right, that was symptomatic of a larger threat of anti-colonial revolt across the globe. And I'm happy to talk, perhaps in the Q&A, about the kind of details of what this surveillance apparatus looked like, how it played out. But for now, I just want to say that British surveillance of Indian migrants in the United States was dependent upon their cooperation with U.S. immigration officials, right? And the exchange of information that immigration officials were giving to British authorities about every Indian migrant that was coming into the country that was deemed suspicious. And another thing that caused an incredible amount of anxiety was the potential dangers of Afro-Asian solidarity. And the most well-known example would be the friendship between Lajpat Rai, who was a very well-known anti-colonial activist, and W.E.B. Du Bois. And Rai was very influenced by Du Bois's work. And their mutual admiration of one another captured sort of the attention of U.S. intelligence officials who were monitoring both of them, right, and who, as one U.S. intelligence official warned, right, quote, "The present Hindu revolutionary movement has definite connections with the Negro agitation in America," end quote. So I'd like to just end by sort of returning to where I began, which is a reflection of, the 100 years that have passed since the passage of the 1917 Immigration Act, and thinking about the centrality of race, right, in the kinds of calls for exclusion and surveillance that the recent efforts that we're seeing in terms of the executive order are strikingly relevant, right, and connected to the same kind of rhetoric that we saw back in 1917, right, immigrant exclusion, surveillance in the name of national security. I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you. Great. If I can just ask you both to make sure that you have unmuted your mics, your lapel mics, so that we can have our conversation. So I think I'm just going to ask each of our speakers one question, and then I want to make sure that there's some time for audience questions. So make sure you have your questions ready, and please do try to limit them to a question. So May, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about how measurement of the body entered into to surveillance of Chinese who were suspected of violating immigration laws in the U.S. I know that you've written about this quite a bit, and it would be interesting to explore some of the parallels to measurement of the body in today's surveillance.
Sure. So Chinese entering or seeking admission to the United States included many who made claims to being citizens. And this was a way that they could circumvent the exclusion laws. And so there was actually quite a robust system of what they call paper son migration, where people had documents or they made claims that they had been born in the United States and then went back to China and then came back, or they had a son in China who then came and claimed derivative citizenship. So the obsession of the immigration authorities was to uncover fraud and to figure out who were really who they claimed to be and not claimed to be. So this was done by two measures. One was through interrogation, which was the photograph I showed you, which could go on for weeks and months, but also through interrogation of the body. And so they would take measurements of the body using the Bertillon system, which was originally a French system. It emerges out of criminal anthropology to understand the criminal body, but there was a whole system of measurements. And then they would also do kind of ocular examination. So into a person's file would go all their measurements, as well as any visible signs like scars or moles or teeth, this kind of thing. So then that information would be in the file. So then somebody coming after that person, or if that person went back and then returned, they would have both the verbal interrogation as well as a record of the person's physical body.
That's great. And there were also blood tests, I believe, done to try to determine paternity, right?
Right. Well, that was mostly during the Cold War, and Chinese exclusion actually had been lifted, but there was still many people with claims to citizenship who were trying to come through Hong Kong into the United States. So they used blood tests to see if people were who they claimed to be in terms of their family relationship.
And Seema, I was wondering, you talked a little bit, you talked certainly about British-U.S. anti-colonialism and some of the cooperation then between Britain and the U.S. I was wondering if you could expound a little bit on what cooperation between British and U.S. Intelligence agencies looked like and some of the parallels to surveillance cooperation among nations today.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the question. So the British surveillance apparatus, I think, sort of really began to develop in India in 1906, right? And so a lot of Indian activists and intellectuals left India, went to Paris, went to Tokyo to try to organize from there, and then were kind of followed, right? And so then they came to the US. I don't know how much they believed this, but what they said in their writings was, well, this will be a safe haven for us because this is the same place you've sort of fought against the same empire that we fought against. So British surveillance, of course, then followed them, right, to the Pacific coast and forged kind of really strong alliances with the Bureau of Immigration, which went all the way up to the Commissioner General of Immigration's office in Washington, D.C., right? And so you have the most well-known figure is a man by the name of William Hopkinson, who was hired in Canada, right, by the Immigration Department, sort of sent by the British to monitor Indian migrants, and who was, quite close, had a very close working relationship with the immigration officials in San Francisco, right? And so they would exchange information with one another. He would write to the Commissioner General of Immigration saying, Har Dayal was a very sort of, he was a radical. He actually was an anarchist. He's speaking at these various places this summer. You need to send immigration officials there to record what he's talking about, right? And then they would attempt to build deportation cases against the most prominent leaders using the 1903 anti-anarchy law, which would allow them to deport anyone deemed an anarchist. And then you also had the U.S. consulates across Asia, consul generals working very closely with, sending information to the State Department back in the U.S. about Indians leaving India that they thought should be monitored. And then the British Embassy in Washington, D.C., sort of, in close cooperation, working very closely with the State Department. And we were talking about, they would give the names of specific people, right, who are coming in. These people need to be monitored. So those are some
obvious parallels.
Yeah.
So I'd like to invite a couple questions from the audience. I think since we have just about 5 minutes left, I think I'm going to invite 2 questions from the audience, and we'll hear both questions, and then maybe make an attempt to answer both of them. So questions? Right here in the front.
Yeah, good morning, and thank you so much for coming. My name is Julian Kyle Lewis. I study international education policy at the American University here in DC. And my question is concerning perception. A lot of the major universities in the district and around the country have been having a very difficult time getting their international students who come from countries like India and South Korea and China and Japan to interact with American students once they get to campus. And they're finding out that just simply putting them in the same room during orientation isn't enough. They kind of have to have different tactics to get people to interact with one another because of the perception of, what you may think of me or what have you such. So what can we do to kind of break down that barrier psychologically so at the collegiate level we can get a more productive conversation on a myriad of intellectual spheres? Thank you very much.
Thank you. And let's invite one more question from the audience to tee up before we turn to our speakers. Yes, over there. Sorry, I see you in the blue dress on the far right first. And Julian reminded me that I ought to remind our speakers, please introduce yourself if you're comfortable doing so.
Sure. Good morning. My name's Shalini Edens. I'm with Urgent Action Fund. Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm curious if you can highlight the historical story that you told was fascinating and also compelling. And you talked a lot about the race aspects and the connections across regions. Can you talk a little bit about the gender and where are we seeing gender show up historically in surveillance? Thank you.
Great. So those are two questions that you guys should be able to answer in 2 minutes each, right? All right, let's take a stab at it.
Okay.
All right, well, on the first question, at my university, we have the same phenomenon, and I think what I observe is that when the students who are organized, the organized students groups, when those organizations reach out to each other, it's a way to begin a process, right? Because they have already a certain consciousness and an interest in building ties with other students, right? And at my university, that seems to mostly be among students of color. So students who are from Asia and Asian Americans working with Latino students, and African American students and African students. So that's, I think, one path where I've seen it start. But that's a long process because there are a lot of, there's both prejudices and I think there's also comfort zones that students find when they're with people like them, right? So that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? On the other question about gender, you know, for Asian migrations in the 19th century and the early 20th century, they were mostly labor migrations. They were mostly men who came. And this created a lot of gender issues, not least which was a disproportionate sex ratio in the immigrant populations. But also some of the racial stereotypes of laboring men were very gendered. So Chinese in many ways were feminized. Well, sometimes they were seen as sexual predators, but mostly they were feminized as being kind of less than manly. And that was also reinforced by Chinese men in the West taking up occupations that were domestic, right? Like washing clothes and cooking food, right? These were jobs that nobody else wanted in the early days of the West. And so they were seen as doing feminine occupations. Chinese women who came to the United States were presumptively considered to be prostitutes. And so they had to prove that they weren't prostitutes, which is, as you know, always hard to prove a negative.
And Seema, if you have thoughts.
Sure, yeah. So I'll take the gender question first.
And this is gonna be the last word too, I think.
Okay.
Right.
No pressure. The same thing. The vast majority were men. But the gender discourse is really fascinating, particularly because so many of these men were Punjabi Sikhs who had a long history of being actively recruited for the British Indian Army in a really problematic British sort of gendering of them as the most martial of Indians. And so a lot of their anti-colonial rhetoric was about recuperating a colonial manhood that they'd been stripped of sort of as colonized subjects. At the same time, a lot of the intellectual men, they were deemed a threat to white womanhood. And so there was definitely a discourse of a fear, right, of them sort of marrying white women, right? And that their exclusion was also deemed, once again, right, protecting white womanhood. And so there very much was a gendered kind of language and rationale operating. In terms of your question, I think I agree with May, which is, this importance of student activist groups, but we can talk about this perhaps more later.
Can I say one more thing? Yes, just one more thing. So throughout the West, in most of the Western states, there were anti-miscegenation laws that were applied to Asians.
Right.
So even though Asian men came on their own, many of them who wanted to settle down in this country, they couldn't bring a wife because of the exclusion laws, but they also were not allowed to marry whites. So among Sikhs in California, you actually had a practice of marrying with Mexican women, and Chinese men often sometimes married Filipino. No, they married Mexicans or, in some cases, African American women.
All right, thank you very much to our speakers, and thanks for the great questions.